Good evening. And welcome to the LeMieux Center for Public Policy at Palm Beach Atlantic University. We are located tonight on the Palm Beach Atlantic University campus in the historic Lassiter Rotunda of the Warren Library. Now, for those of you that know me as Bill Fleming, president of Palm Beach Atlantic, you may have thought that that first sentence was a bit informal. And indeed it was, because we are live streaming tonight's presentation. So I invite you to silence your cell phones, put them on mute, triple check that you have done so. And we are live streaming this for many reasons, but the one I want you to focus on are two families, one in Wisconsin and one in Pennsylvania, who are tuned in, sitting on the edge of their couches and extremely excited, perhaps just a tad nervous, about tonight's presentation by Aaron and Nate. However, I know those parents, and I know their sons, and I know they are full of hope and amazingly excited because of the preparation that they have done, not just for tonight, but throughout their careers, their stellar careers at Palm Beach Atlantic University. So tonight, the LeMieux Center for Public Policy presents its annual LeMieux Fellows presentation. You will hear information about both of the 2019 fellows. Senator LeMieux will make those introductory remarks. The LeMieux Center for Public Policy is Florida's premier center of excellence for public policy. We're excited that it is here on the campus of Palm Beach Atlantic University in West Palm Beach, Florida. It is committed to civil discourse and civic engagement. It is committed to providing public affairs programs as well as undergraduate research of the best kind, and you will be hearing from our two 2019 fellows this evening. None of this, however, would be possible if Palm Beach Atlantic University had not snatched or grabbed the dream of United States Senator George LeMieux. And for that, dreams do come true at PBA, and we are extremely grateful to Senator LeMieux for dreaming about the LeMieux Center for Public Policy. Would you join me in saluting former United States Senator George LeMieux? Tonight is the sixth presentation of undergraduate research. And we are delighted that you are here. Many of you are taking notes because as I look at our audience, I know several of you are interested in applying for and being seriously considered for the 2020 LeMieux Fellows Program. And I will tell you that recently the university was blessed to receive funding for those fellows, and we will call the 2020 LeMieux Fellows the Friedheim Fellows in honor of the generosity of Mr. and Mrs. Cyrus Friedheim. We thank them for their belief in and investment in the young minds of Palm Beach Atlantic University students studying here. As I survey the previous LeMieux Fellows, it really is a cast of all-stars, individuals who have gone on to accomplish great things. newest of which is Evan Berlanti, who has just joined the United States State Department, where he is serving as a special assistant for an assistant secretary for the State Department. So we can only imagine, we can only dream with Nate and Aaron about what their futures hold, and we're very excited, not just for tonight, but even more for what's to come. We congratulate both of you gentlemen for reaching this pinnacle of success, and we look forward to your comments this evening. While I have an audience gathered for the LeMieux Center, let me mention December the 2nd, Monday evening, December the 2nd, the LeMieux Center will be hosting a lecture by Dr. Arthur Brooks, recently retired President and CEO of the American Enterprise Institute, the AEI, in Washington, D.C. That event will be held in the DeSantis Family Chapel. Come early for a good seat. There is no charge for that lecture, but I hope that you will join us as Dr. Brooks presents a commentary about the culture of America. We do not have an early spring 2020 date confirmed for former United States Secretary of State Dr. Condoleezza Rice, but we are hoping to secure that date in the very near future. The LeMieux Center for Public Policy is named for a great Floridian, and I introduce now former United States Senator George LeMieux.
Good evening. Thank you, President Fleming. I'm thrilled to be with you here tonight, and I have to say, looking out in the audience, that this is probably the largest attendance we've had at one of our fellows' presentations over the past 6 times that we've done this. One of the true joys of my life is having the opportunity to work with 2 fantastic Palm Beach Atlantic students every spring on a major research project along with their faculty advisor. I find that I get more out of this, I think, than even the students do. And the part to me that is so meaningful is that what happens invariably every year is that the fellow realizes that the research project that they're working on is bigger than the topic that they've selected, that there is a larger truth that they understand in their research, and it usually transforms the product and the paper that they write. That happened this year as well. And I could not be more proud of the work that Aaron and Nate did. I think they are among the finest of the fellows that we've had here at Palm Beach Atlantic. And I know that you will be very much interested in their findings that they will present to you tonight. And I also look forward to seeing their success in the future, because I know they have big things ahead of them. I want to thank President Fleming. The idea of this Public Policy Center would not have happened without his encouragement, without his steadfast support. I want to thank Vicki Pugh for helping us raise the dollars that make it successful. Mayor, thank you for being here tonight, because you've done so much to support us. It's with our advisory board members that we're able to raise the funds to support the scholarships for our fellows, to allow them to do their research, sometimes travel, sometimes buy books, get the materials they need to be able to do their papers. But also, when we have Dr. Brooks come, or Secretary Rice come, or any of the folks that we've had over the past 7 years, many of those folks receive an honorarium. And so normally, we couldn't open those kind of events up to the public. It would have to be a paid event. We're able to offer those events for free because of the generosity of our board of advisors, so I'm very grateful to them. Let me introduce to you tonight our student fellows who are going to present to you and tell you a little bit about them and the work that they're going to speak of. First of all, I want to recognize faculty advisors for each of them. Dr. Doherty, who's a professor of biology, was Aaron's faculty advisor, and Dr. Rader, back for a return performance, I think we've worked together 3 or 4 times now, was Nate's faculty advisor. Let me introduce to you first Aaron Buch. Aaron is a medicinal and biological chemistry graduate. He is from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He graduated from Palm Beach Atlantic magna cum laude, and as I think many of the people in this room know, served as your student government president. He is currently teaching biology and health at Shoreland Lutheran High School in Wisconsin, which is in an area about 30 minutes south of Milwaukee. And his topic tonight is scientific overview and Christian perspective on gene editing research. Let's give Aaron a round of applause. Our next fellow is Nate Esbenshade. He is a politics major from Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. He served as the vice president of the student government, so we have the line of succession intact here. He is currently interning at the Commonwealth Foundation in Pennsylvania, where he is doing public policy work, getting a great basis for that here at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and he will be applying to graduate schools in the fall of 2020. His topic is the theoretical and empirical analysis of the United States, Mexico, Canada trade agreement, which you're going to learn more about today. So the order of the program will be that Aaron will present first. We will then grill him with very difficult questions that we've been working on all week. And then I'm going to invite Aaron to the podium and he will, then I'll invite Nate to the podium and he will follow Aaron. So with that, Aaron, you're going to start us off. And take a deep breath. You're going to do great. And we look forward to your presentation. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, everybody. It is such an honor to be back here on Palm Beach Atlantic's campus. Before I begin tonight, I just want to thank the Senator and President Fleming and my lovely advisor to help me out with this project. It could not have happened without them. It has been very formative and I would say even transformative of my experience here at Palm Beach Atlantic. So, as President Fleming and Senator said, I had the opportunity to look at gene editing and look at it from a Christian perspective, which I don't think we get much of within the scientific community. So, we've got a lot to unpack and we've got a long way to go. So let's start at the beginning. In 1997, there was a film known as Gattaca, and you know it's a good 2000s film because it's got Jude Law in it, it's got Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman, all really big people at that time. Basic premise of the movie was we are in a not so far distant future, and science has developed to the point where we can now have designer babies, basically choose how we want our offspring to look, choose their personality, choose what they're good at, choose all of their traits that we would like. We can make them athletic. We can make them beautiful. And this seems very futuristic, right? This seems like way off into the future. No way can I choose what my child looks like or what they are going to be able to have genetically. But I'm here to tell you that that future is not as far off as you think. Just as recently as last year, a Chinese scientist named He Zhonghui actually brought 2 embryos to term, 2 baby girls, and made them immune to the HIV virus. So genetic editing people already walk among us. And this is a very serious topic and a lot to unpack here. So before I actually get to the gene editing, I first have to talk about the central dogma of biology or central principle of biology. I'm going to take you back to high school biology. Don't worry, I'm a high school teacher. I should know this mostly by now. What the central dogma of biology revolves around is this idea that DNA, that molecule that basically makes up you, controls all of the natural processes within inside of your cells, gets translated into RNA and ultimately becomes proteins. Basically, all the things that make up your chemical processes. Your proteins drive all of those. And part of this here is, think about it for a second. If there are changes made to the DNA, there are going to be downstream effects from that, right? So any changes that we make ultimately are going to affect what proteins and what we look like and how our bodies function and perform. And this is the central idea of gene editing. Gene editing is basically a biological technique that scientists use to choose a specific sequence of DNA and go in and edit it. We have a couple of definitions up there from the Merriam-Webster, from Synthego, an actual company that gives CRISPR-Cas9 materials out to, is basically a distributor. But I don't think these definitions fully encapsulate what gene editing really is at the heart of it. So I've made my own composite definition. Gene editing is the intentional act of going into the genome and altering the genes of a living organism for a desired condition or trait that we want, also known as the phenotype. It's an intentional act. We go in and we choose as scientists what we want to edit and what we want to change. The other two definitions I don't think quite describe that or capture that essence and piece. So, as I talked about, we have the capabilities to do that, and right now that is known as CRISPR-Cas9. It is the quickest, most efficient, and simplest way by which we can gene edit right now. Other gene editing techniques have not had the same success as CRISPR. CRISPR is just an acronym that stands for clustered, regularly interspaced palindromic repeats. I know that's a lot, but basically it's basically the adaptive immune system of bacteria. Bacteria are able to capture viral DNA and use it against viruses when they try to infect them by using these sequences to cut up the DNA and not allow it to get into the genome of the bacteria, otherwise it would end up dying. So, taking a look at the history, I'm not going to go through all of it. If you want to learn more about it, I gave a presentation at the IRC last year. It's on the PBA YouTube page, so if you'd like to see it. But this is just to give you a background and idea that this is a very recent discovery. This has happened within all of your lifetimes. And the past 7 years has been an absolute and utter whirlwind of scientific discovery. And right now, the FDA has approved the first couple of CRISPR treatments already in the United States. So it's coming very soon and coming very quickly. How it works, and I think this might be one of the parts that I'm going to probably have to go very bare bones. There are three major components here. You have a protein and two pieces of RNA. The crRNA, or the CRISPR RNA, is basically the GPS components. It's programmed with the correct target sequence of DNA to specifically go there and connect with it. The tracer RNA, or the trACR RNA, just kind of holds it on and connects it to the larger protein known as Cas9. And Cas9's job is, if that matches up perfectly with that target sequence of DNA, it is able to induce what's known as a double-stranded break, or cut the DNA, creating now two segments of DNA. And from that break, cells have to repair that. Cells don't repair that, they end up dying. Quite literally. They aren't able to function anymore. So they repair these breaks a plethora of ways, and depending on how they repair it is how we can alter the gene. We can either knock out the gene by making it induce an edit or a deletion or a part that's not right, or if we do it big enough, we can actually insert entire genes into the genome of a living organism, genes that weren't there at the present. So we can create chimeras, we can do all sorts of things. But just because we should be able to do it doesn't mean that we necessarily should or have to. Taking a look now at what we're doing with CRISPR and Cas9, we're doing a ton. Improvements in agriculture, we're making plants and crops and livestock able to grow faster. We're allowing them to resist disease better, controlling them against pests. And this is creating, I would say, a better market and actually helping somewhat in reducing our carbon footprint on the environment. We're making farms more efficient and better through this type of technology. We also have the opportunity to restore extinct species or remove invasive ones. Scientists at MIT right now are trying to bring back the woolly mammoth by converting the DNA of the Indian elephant. They're off by 1 million base pairs, so quite a few, but they're trying to bring back the woolly mammoth through CRISPR-Cas9 and through gene editing. They're also trying to remove invasive ones. Right now, some top scientists, if they get it correct, could potentially remove the state bird of Wisconsin. Don't worry, don't be sad, it's known as the mosquito. And with that, it would be removing all of the mosquito-bound diseases that we have, things like malaria, things like Zika, things like yellow fever. All of those would be gone if we removed the mosquito. The problem is that there are some other moral and ethical things. Can we just remove an organism from an entire habitat? I don't know if that's really the best option, but scientists are looking at the possibility. But the biggest thing that we're looking at here is the medical advancement that can come from this. Genetic disorders are prevalent throughout all of society, and we can't cure them because they're inherently part of who you are. They're part of your DNA. And because they are, we have to treat the symptoms, not cure the disease. But through CRISPR-Cas9, we might be able to actually cure those people. Things like blood-borne diseases, sickle cell anemia, beta thalassemia, diseases that are within the blood and really affect and really, I would say, hurt people to a large degree. There is now the research that we can cure those. And that's actually part of some of the FDA development that they've been working on. We also have the ability to maybe cure tissues, so curing lung tissue of cystic fibrosis, that awful disease where crystalline mucus hardens within your lungs, makes it very difficult to breathe, makes it very difficult to live. And most of these people, through medical intervention, are able to live until they're only 20 or 30, before they would live they would die much quicker. They wouldn't be able to live as long. And the other piece with this is known as CAR T cells. This is basically the new cutting research of cancer therapy. By CAR T cells, we look into the genome of a person. We see what type of cancer they have. And then we take their white blood cells. We take them out. We engineer them so that they can attack cancer cells and cure cancer with your immune system. The first person they did it with at the University of Penn was known as William Ludwig. He had 3 different types of stage 4 melanoma cancer. They did this treatment with him, cured in 6 months. Cancer was in full remission. Incredible stuff. But there are 2 different types of gene editing that I want to talk about. Somatic cell and germline editing. Somatic cell first. Somatic cell editing is where we edit the cells of your own body. So I edit Kate Magro cells. She has a genetic disorder. We edit her cells. She's cured. And when Kate Magro dies, those cells die with her. They don't get passed on to the next generation. But germline editing is not like that. This is editing the reproductive cells, your sperm, your egg, your embryos, your zygotes. And when we edit these cells, these edits are passed on to future generations, which has huge ethical and moral implications about what does the next generation look like if I'm willing to edit that next generation. So I have 3 major questions we're going to look at within CRISPR-Cas9 today. We're going to briefly go through the social justice in gene editing. So does it create more unity or actually create more division between groups? Just want to make sure I'm on the right slide. All right. Other question, what does the relationship between a parent and a child look like now within a world that I can choose what my genetics look like of my child? And the last one I'm going to look at very briefly is, do we have a moral obligation to end human suffering if we have the means, i.e. gene editing? So if we have gene editing at our disposal, why would we not use it to cure human suffering? So we'll start with the first topic, social justice. First piece in there, is this going to be affordable to everybody? Absolutely not. 110% no. These are new cutting-edge treatments. So that means it's going to be very difficult. The Washington Post ran an article looking at Leber congenital amaurosis, which is basically a genetic disorder. By the age of 20, you go instantly blind. So you have sight up until the age of 20, and then after that, you start to lose it and go blind. Costs $50,000 per eye. So do the math, how much money is that? $1 million. Out of pocket. Because no insurance company has any background about what that cure is going to look like. 150,000. 500,000. My bad. My apologies. Thank you for pointing that out. Yep. $500,000. My apologies. And insurance companies aren't going to cover it probably because they have no background on it, and this is experimental surgery, basically. It's not seen as life-threatening necessarily, and they're going to be able to live a life, but not maybe a full life. But we have to look at the cost of the cure versus the cost of the symptoms. I briefly mentioned this before. It might be more effective to get a genetic disorder out before it happens than let it continue to go on, because think about all the repeated doctor's visits that you have to go to. Think about all the medicine that you might have to take. It might be cheaper just to get it over with and have it happen. But unfortunately, this isn't going to be available to everyone, which then begs the question, well, what's that going to look like? And we reach the realm known as genetic determinism, or as Vincent Freeman says in Gattaca, we have discrimination down to a science, We discriminate based upon our genetics. Juliet and Romeo aren't getting together because they're from separate families now. It's because Romeo has been gene edited for all different diseases and all different issues, and Juliet doesn't have that. That's basically what we're looking at, where we start to divide, and at some point, people believe that a speciation might happen, where we have this diverging of human populations, where we have a gene rich, as Bill McKibben puts it, or a gen poor, where these two groups are so different from one another that they're not able to reproduce with one another. But Gregory Stock doesn't believe that. Gregory Stock that says that that's ludicrous, that it would basically have to involve human populations separating themselves in the vast regions of space before that would ever happen. And I agree with him, not on that point, but on this point. More visible barriers have separated us as individuals throughout our lives. More divisive barriers, things like race, things like creed, things like religion, things like nationality, those have not created a speciation. Those are visible barriers. This is not as visible. You can't tell somebody's genetically edited just by looking at them. But you probably are thinking this too on the terms of eugenics. Jennifer Doudna, actually one of the leading scientists who did research and actually broke open the CRISPR-Cas9 case, talks about a dream that she had where she's walking down the hall at her UC Berkeley laboratory and Hitler's sitting there in her office wanting to know about CRISPR-Cas9 so he can bring it back to his country and create a master race with it. And that's what eugenics is, taking the best genes, quotation marks, and trying to make a better society because of it. And unfortunately, it's very difficult because it is a thing that's happened, right? The 20s, 30s, and 40s were huge platforms with eugenic research. And it was based upon bad science. It was funded by governments who had racist and ideologies that were against what we as Christians would accept. But there are other factors at play that might be able to bring eugenics back into the forefront. Things like the free market, things like parental pressure, things like societal pressure. You know, if I have a child and I hear that Tim and Susan are down the street going to genetically engineer their child so that she's a smart kid, and I hear that a couple further down the road takes up on that and says, sure, we'll genetically modify my kid. Well, then think about my kid. Am I going to be pressured then? Do I want my kid to be the dumb kid on the block? I don't necessarily want that as a parent, which kind of leads me into my next point of the need for regulation and transparency with this type of technology. We need to be open, we need to know what's going on, and we need to be able to monitor it, because living in a free market society, this could dictate and go many different ways if we don't have it under control. Which then brings us to, what does the relationship between parents and children look like? I don't know if you've ever thought of this before, but quite honestly, you as a child are a gift to your parents. The human-child relationship, or the parent-child relationship, is the only one that humans enter into without prior knowledge of the human being. They quite honestly accept them for what they are, all of their flaws. The theologian William May describes it as this openness to an unbidden, where parents walk into the relationship at a very humbling point, because they don't know what you're going to be good at. But with genetic editing, now I do. Now I know that you're supposed to be edited to play basketball. Now I know that you're supposed to be edited to be a world-class pianist. Now I know that you're supposed to be getting A's and B's instead of C's and D's. And that's really tough to look at when we try to break it down. And we have to talk about the moral status of the human embryo. And I'm not going to get into the deep nitty-gritty of that, but I think we can all agree that the human embryo cannot offer consent for itself. It can't say, I want these edits to happen to me. And so it falls on the parents. However, if a parent doesn't enter that from a spiritual background, knowing that their child is flawed with sin, knowing that their child has issues and is going to have issues on planet Earth, they are going to be liable to reach and overstep the boundaries that are there as parents, because we already edit our children to a degree with human limits in mind. We already put Billy into the elite baseball programs. We already try to teach him how to throw a curveball at age 5. We already try to get the best tutors and the best teachers and the best people to be around our children and to teach them skills. But what happens when we remove those limits? What happens when we take those away? all of a sudden, we have now removed the ability for the parent to be humble. And if I say exacerbated helicopter parents to a new level. And it's a very, very dangerous road to be traveling because there's a return on investment. If I invest at the start, if I put investment right away at the beginning, I'm going to expect an outcome. And if I don't get that, who am I going to go to? Am I going to go to the company that was supposed to genetically engineer my child? Am I going to go to my child and say, you're a failure? Lot to unpack there, a lot to look. Last piece we're going to look at is the moral obligation to human suffering. Or in a Christian sense, are we sinning by not offering this type of technology to people? The secular world would look at suffering and say it's uncontrollable. Call it karma, call it fate, call it the gods raging down, their dictation on me, whatever. It just happens to us. But if it's something that happens to us, I can control it, I can direct it. Whereas the Christian would look at suffering and say, no, suffering's part of the world that we chose. At the fall, we chose this world. Christ says it in John 16:13 or John 16:33. You're going to have trouble in this world. Suffering's going to be all around you. It's just going to be a part of you. But this argument has exacerbated itself into a different place, looking at transhumanists and bioconservatives. I have a little type of diagram that you got here. Normally you would see transhumanists and bioconservatives and think they're on opposite sides of the podium, and they're not. Transhumanists want to push scientific technology and progress to its highest point and not guard any of the ethics or morals of that. Whereas the other side of that would be, we don't need any technical advancements. Those would be Amish people. Those would be, God is going to provide, God is going to give us what we need. The bioconservatives have looked at this and seen, maybe not every technological advancement is great. And so they've started to come down from that pendulum and start to find themselves somewhere in the middle. And I think the President's Council of Bioethics puts it the best, that if we look at it from this standpoint, if we care for how long we live, not also how we live, we miss the point. We miss the point of life itself. If we're so concerned about being healthy and not concerned about the values and morals and ethics of life, we lose a lot, and we lose a ton. We actually erode the foundation for the next generation to come. So where do we go when we hit the yellow light? Because I would say gene editing is a yellow light. Are we going to pound on the gas and try to get through it like good Floridians? Are we going to try to tap the brakes a little bit and see as we get closer? Or are we going to stop right away when we see it? That's a tough question. And I would say right now a tap of the brakes is needed. Because if we progress too far, we're going to get into the middle of that intersection. The red light's going to change and we're going to probably get T-boned. We're probably going to be hit, blindsided, if we don't talk about these issues and don't look at them from this perspective. C.S. Lewis probably puts it the best way, that any power that man gets through nature is ultimately a power that man can use over other men with nature as the instrument. And so I would say in terms of the moral obligation of human suffering, we should care for our brothers and sisters in Christ. We should be aware of their shortcomings and sufferings. But to say that we need technological advancements to ultimately change and ultimately cure them, I would say maybe an overstep to a degree. Last couple of pieces here, I'm going to move through them really quickly. Therapy enhancement, is there a difference? Well, we have to talk about normal human health. You have two definitions there. World Health Organization would basically say health is the absence of everything, the absence of all infirmities. Now I ask you, from that definition, are you healthy? Because no one on planet Earth is going to be healthy under that definition. I think a better definition is the second one, that health is an equilibrium that you establish as an individual based upon your physical and social environment. You establish an equilibrium within yourself, and everyone's baseline of that is different. But I would say that therapy is enhancement, because if we accept that second definition, we're raising their baseline of health. My sister's a type 1 diabetic. She can't produce insulin by herself. That is her baseline health. And that would mean if she didn't have an insulin pump or have other things to help her, she would probably die. Just the long and short of it there. But if I were to edit her pancreas to the point where I could have her produce insulin, I have raised her baseline of health, taking her to a new level that she wasn't at before, and essentially enhancing her. And that's the difficult nature about therapy enhancement. They're one and the same to a degree, and it's hard to separate both of them. The other piece of this is there's a trade-off involved. There are no good genes necessarily. There's always a trade-off there. Just because you may be super intelligent also might mean, according to Jim Kuzbeck in his book that he did on CRISPR-Cas9 research, you might also have more of an opportunity to develop a mental health disorder or struggle with depression. There's a correlation there. I don't know what the cause is, but there is a correlation to a degree. There are no beneficial genes over the top of the other. And so depending on our definition of health, these conditions like deafness, blindness, autism, Down syndrome, depending on what definition of health that we accept, might be labeled and seen as inferior people, that their life doesn't matter. And I would strongly recommend that all life does matter, and that we need to look at those people and keep them in mind when we talk about this type of technology. Last piece here, going to go through it really fast. How do we handle this now as a country, societally, and individually? It's actually really interesting. I did this research over the summer. In 2016 and 2019, the U.S. Senate House Appropriations Committee, wrote an amendment into the spending bill stating that the FDA was banned from looking at any edits to the germline editing. They couldn't do any research within the germline and approve that type of research to be taken. House Democrats wanted to open up this language a little bit more, to expand it to maybe allow some of those things to happen, but they took a look at all of these pieces and said, no, we're going to limit ourselves on germline editing. Most states don't currently have such regulations. It's still pretty open, but it re-echoes the statement that was made on human cloning about 20 years ago with the President's Council for Bioethics and George W. Bush. They basically said the FDA was not allowed to look into human cloning. They were not allowed to do anything. They weren't allowed to federally fund it. Not to say that the states couldn't make their decisions, but the federal government was not going to be a part of it. We already stand up there, as you can see, that 83% of us believe that editing a baby for its intelligence to increase it is wrong. So we already understand that there's a limit, but the question is, where is that limit and where is that line that we were willing to draw? Internationally, there's no current binding agreement, but we've talked about it a lot. Things like the Washington Summit, where Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier came together and brought in not just scientists and researchers, but also bioethicists, theologians, sociologists, psychologists, social justice workers, and talked about what this technology would look like and really dug into it. Other countries like China, Japan, Germany have taken stances on it and said, we're not going to look into germline editing at this time. Some people believe a body should be established so that it can oversee germline editing and make sure that there isn't any research done that is, ineffective or bad necessarily. But with this moratorium that is in place, or this temporary ban, there is still the possibility of continuing to move forward, which is why I say is individually, we need to be well versed in this topic, because there might come a time, it might come a day that we are asked to vote on it, or we are asked to talk about it and discuss whether or not we're going to invite this into our world, the ability to dictate what the next generation looks like. And this isn't just an issue that science has to wrestle with. This is an issue of humanity, and this is an issue of what it truly means to be human, because our DNA affects a lot of parts of our lives. And if we're unable to look at it from that standpoint, we're never going to be able to move forward. That's why we need more input. That's why we need more people engaged on this discussion. We need more discussion on it, frankly, and the level of discussion needs to continue to grow. But I think the last point there is very prevalent. As Christians, we know that we are finite beings, and some limits of our finitude need to be valued over that. We need to decide what side of heaven we want to live on. Do we want to live on earth and make heaven on earth and try to eliminate sin from earth? That's going to be a war that we are going to lose, because we know that sin is everywhere and infects us. Or, as Christians, do we want to look to the future and say, we're going to help as many people as possible, but honestly, we're living for something more and we're living for something better. So my final evaluation on gene editing is somatic cell research can continue. I really do believe that that is the next phase of a lot of the research and a lot of the cures that are going to come by this. But germline editing cannot. We need to establish the line, draw it in stone, not in the sand, and say, as much as this could provide benefits for us, we need to step back from that line and say, as tempting as it is, we are going to stay the way we are. Thank you.
So we're gonna do the questions all at the end for everybody. So okay. So Nate, why don't you present to us, and then we'll do the questions of both of you when you're finished.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Hope you are all getting extra credit from Dr. Rader. Thank you, Dr. Rader, for being my mentor through this whole project. And thank you, President Fleming and Senator LeMieux. So the economic impact of the USMCA, if you don't know what that means, we'll get to it. It just stands for the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement. And this is the update, or the new Nafta, if you want to call it that, that President Trump signed almost a year ago, like 2 days ago, October 1st, 2018. So in an increasingly global economy, international trade policy can have drastic effects on domestic economics. Beginning with Adam Smith, economists regarded free trade as a way for nations to truly prosper through increased access to goods. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was a hallmark agreement for its time and led to more free trade agreements for the United States thereafter. And more than 20 years after NAFTA went into effect, President Trump, who was a highly critical as a candidate, he was highly critical of the agreement, fulfilled his campaign promise to update NAFTA, or to attempt to update NAFTA, and introduced the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And in order to properly understand the USMCA, we must first look at NAFTA, because there's a good chance you probably don't know what it means, or you know what's in it. Then we will examine the USMCA, what is new and different, and how it could impact the U.S. economy. And we'll conclude with a discussion on whether the USMCA is considered protectionist or free trade, and my thoughts on the potential passage of the agreement. So first, NAFTA, like I said, stands for North American Free Trade Agreement, and the purpose it went into effect in 1994, and its purpose was to encourage economic growth and integration among the North American countries, Mexico and Canada, by eliminating trade barriers, making provisions for intellectual property rights, and increasing investment opportunities. NAFTA aimed to stimulate the economies of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. One of its provisions was to progressively eliminate tariffs on almost all goods and services traded among the three countries, and with the exception of certain agricultural products between Canada and the United States, all tariffs and whatnot were eliminated. In addition, non-tariff barriers like quotas were also removed. The United States and Canada were obviously prosperous before NAFTA, and they even had a free trade agreement between them already in place. So NAFTA was really about opening trade and liberalizing trade with Mexico. In the years leading up to NAFTA, Mexico was already liberalizing, but NAFTA was a way for the United States and Canada to cement their liberalization of trade, and also to make sure that they don't go back and implement more protectionist policies. This is important, or that agreement was important because more than $12 billion, Mexico's economic restructuring and tariff lowering, which led to an increase in the U.S. exports to the country from $12 billion in 1986 to $44 billion in 1982. So you can see they're increasing exponentially their trade leading up to NAFTA. And so what were the goals and expectations for NAFTA? The main goal for NAFTA was to increase exports to Mexico, which was successful. Mexico went from being the United States' third largest trading partner to its second a few years after it was implemented. And then a secondary goal of the NAFTA was to act as a springboard for more free trade agreements with Central and South American countries. And that has been largely successful, as we currently have free trade agreements with 11 additional South American and Central American countries. And then a third expectation of NAFTA was that it would curb illegal immigration by boosting the Mexico economy. But this expectation failed to materialize, and there's evidence that illegal immigration increased as a result of NAFTA, actually. And illegal immigration from Mexico increased throughout the 90s and hit its peak in 2007. So what then did NAFTA actually accomplish? The Council on Foreign Relations maintains that economists largely agree NAFTA has provided benefits to the North American economies. Regional trade increased sharply over the treaty's first 2 decades, roughly from $290 billion in 1993 to $1.1 trillion in 2016. Cross-border investment has also surged, with U.S. foreign direct investment stock in Mexico increasing in that period from $15 billion to $100 billion. And then additionally, most estimates conclude that the U.S. GDP increased by 0.5%, or a total additional $80 billion to the economy upon full implementation. These benefits sound pretty modest, and that's because they are. Trade deals like this have a widely dispersed effect on the economy. So direct benefits are difficult to connect. And the 90s were a time of increased technological advancement, so that actually makes it even harder to, where are the benefits. And then there was even more increased trade with China throughout the 90s and early 2000s. But proponents and critics of NAFTA have drawn different conclusions from existing studies. For example, critics have argued that their predictions for major job losses in the manufacturing sector came true, while proponents acknowledge the loss in jobs but point to the benefits to consumers in the form of lower prices. And so one of the most important assessments of NAFTA for the overall U.S. economy was described by the Center on Foreign Relations, and they said, they emphasize that increased trade produces gain for the overall U.S. economy. Some jobs are lost due to imports, but others are created, and consumers benefit significantly from the falling prices and often improve quality of goods created by import competition. A 2014 study of NAFTA's effects found that 15,000 jobs on net are lost each year due to the pact, but for each of those jobs lost, the economy gains roughly $450,000 in the form of higher productivity and lower consumer prices. And so before talking about the USMCA, I want to talk about comparative advantage and why that is important for free trade. Comparative advantage is the economic theorem that explains how one agent has an advantage over another agent in producing a good at the same quality for a cheaper price, or producing a better quality for a cheaper price, which is a lot of jargon for saying if Colombia and Brazil and Ethiopia can make coffee better than the United States and cheaper, then we're going to make it, or they're going to grow coffee in the United States, and then we can buy it. Americans can buy coffee cheaper than if we try to grow it here, because our climate doesn't really support the growth of coffee. And so Mexico currently has a comparative advantage in the labor market over the United States for manufacturing, so manufacturing jobs a lot of times will go to Mexico. But we're here to talk about the USMCA. So, what is it? And why is it important and all that? It is important because it is critical to the future of the U.S. economy, because Mexico and Canada are the recipients of 34% of American exports and constitute 26.2% of American imports. In my home state of Pennsylvania, 500,000 jobs are supported by trade between the three countries, and almost $17 billion of goods and services are exported to Canada and Mexico. And that was a study done in 2017. And then here in Florida, 750,000 jobs are supported by the trilateral trade, and more than $12 billion are exported to Canada and Mexico in goods and services. And then an important question that we need to ask is, what is the constitutional process of passing a trade agreement? Because is this law, is it not? I mean, it's currently not a law. So the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, states that the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States, to regulate commerce in foreign nations, or with foreign nations and among the several states. So from Article 1, we gather that trade agreements fall under the powers of Congress. And then you may be wondering, how then did Trump pass this or sign this? And the answer is found in the Article 2 of the Constitution, which deals with the executive power. And it says he shall have the power by and with advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties provided for 2/3 of the senators provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. And so the USMCA is not a treaty, it's a trade deal. And so basically the president has the power to informally make a trade agreement that then goes through Congress, and then it'll become official and national law. The original expectation for this agreement to take effect was January 1st, 2020, but that means the vote will have to take place this fall, which seems unlikely, but I'll get into that later. So the main provisions, the USMCA was designed as an update to Nafta that would benefit all the countries involved. Some of the major provisions deal with agriculture and manufacturing. Another significant aim of the USMCA was to update regulations to reflect advances in technology, such as the development of the internet. And so I talk a lot about agriculture and the auto industry in depth. So before I go on, I'll mention intellectual property here. The USMCA further includes expansions of the updates to the intellectual property laws. The objective for this states that the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights should contribute to the promotion of technological innovation, into the transfer and dissemination of technology, to the mutual advantage of producers and users of technology, and there's more jargon. But the importance is, if you've been paying attention to the kind of trade war with China, Trump's biggest complaint is that China steals our intellectual property. So in the USMCA, there's language that makes stricter intellectual property laws so that Canada or Mexico can't steal US citizens' ideas and produce them for cheaper. And so the impact on the auto industry. One of the initial impacts will be on the wages of workers involved in the automobile manufacturing. So according to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the increased wage provision aims to achieve several goals. It aims to support better jobs for the United States producers and workers by requiring that a significant portion of vehicle content be made with high wage labor, ensure that United States producers and workers are able to compete on an even playing field, and incentivize new vehicle parts investments in the United States. And time will only tell if these goals will actually be achieved, but it appears that many of the people involved are optimistic. And so the specific provisions are a $16 minimum wage for 30% of the vehicles manufactured in North America, which is a significant pay increase for Mexican manufacturers. But the real goal is to keep manufacturing in North America, or in the United States with the agreement. But this agreement stipulates that 30% of cars, rising to 40% by 2023, must be made by workers earning $16 an hour, about 3 times the typical manufacturing wage in Mexico. There's also a provision that enables workers to more easily form unions. Now, one problem is that this could create or incentivize Ford and GM and all those other companies to try to get to automation quicker, which means that people will lose jobs no matter what. And then there could also be more outsourcing from Mexico to actually like Honduras or Guatemala or cheaper countries' labor. So corporations find a way to make a profit, really. And so now we can move on to the impact on agriculture. So with respect to the agriculture industry, we see that the USMCA could be especially beneficial for American dairy farmers in order to protect its dairy industry. Canada created a new class of dairy products in early 2017 called Class 7. And this pricing system covers milk protein, skim, and whole milk powders. In effect, Canada's new pricing class protected its dairy market from outside exporters in the USMCA. That Class 7 pricing system will be eliminated, so the United States dairy farmers will have increased access to the Canadian dairy market. And then there's also additional provisions for wheat. So there will be increased access, well, not increased access, but U.S. wheat will be just as competitive as Canadian wheat in the Canadian wheat market, essentially. So what about further impacts of this trade agreement? The famous economist Henry Hazlitt, in his book Economics in One Lesson, wrote, "The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate but the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy not for one group but for all groups." And so the problem with the provisions that I talked about is that its effects will reach beyond the specific groups at the expense of the consumer, but also like even more. Up here I have what about the tire industry or the rubber industry and steel industry that goes into making cars. Legislation has wide-reaching effects that our legislators don't often think about when they make their legislation. So is this free trade agreement protectionist or free trade? And the simple answer is both. The free trade part is that the USMCA continues all of the Nafta agreements, but some of the additional provisions of the USMCA are protectionist. Now, what is protectionism? For the sake of time, I won't really go too much into detail, but I think I should give some explanation. International protectionism is the view of international trade policy that regards free trade as potentially damaging to one's own country. Therefore, tariffs, duties, quotas, and other economic obstacles to trade must be put in place in order to protect the industries within the home country. So Trump talks a lot about putting America first, and that's kind of like a protectionist mantra, putting your own country first. And now, protectionism is based on several fallacies about trade, but the two biggest ones we hear most often are we need to protect X industry against outsourcing to Y country because they do the same thing, and also the cheap labor argument. And both of these arguments are powerful because they appeal to a large group of organized, appeals to a lot of organized groups. And organized groups can influence legislators more easily. And people care about their jobs, but they rarely understand the long-term benefits of an industry going to a cheaper labor market or being automated. The main protectionist policy in the USMCA is in the automobile industry that I mentioned. And those policies are meant to protect automobile manufacturers from losing their jobs to cheaper labor. Excuse me. For all his talk, President Trump's preference for protectionism was pretty limited in this agreement. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that the USMCA is a repackaging of NAFTA for a political win for Trump. He delivered on his promise to renegotiate NAFTA, and protecting the jobs of manufacturers speaks to those people in the Rust Belt that voted for him in 2016. Because politics are so polarized right now, it is unlikely many Democrats would be willing to vote for this trade agreement to give Trump the win. And the recent developments on Monday, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about why the Democrats are refusing to vote for a win for the American workers, as they call it. We will see if that has any influence, but I'm not confident a vote for the trade agreement is going to happen before January or is likely to happen at all. Now, do I think it should get passed? It's a tough question, but I reluctantly say yes. In an ideal world, there would be no need for trade agreements. People would trade freely with each other. We don't live in an ideal world, and the USMCA is beneficial even if it's not perfect because it gives everyone clear expectations about the future of trade in North America, and expectations help manufacturers and consumers alike. So, thank you.
Yeah. So Nate, since we have you up there, we're going to start with you.
Okay.
We'll go back and forth. But so this America First policy that you're talking about and the president's focused on, is it really America first for jobs over America first for consumers?
I would say it's America first for jobs. I think if you look at the president's rhetoric, he cares a lot about jobs and the labor market. He talks a lot about jobs leaving America and going to China or Mexico or India. And people care about their jobs, so it speaks to them. And so this agreement, especially the stuff about the auto industry, is about helping auto manufacturers in America keep their jobs.
What about the jobs that are lost as a result of people having to pay higher prices for U.S. autos? What about the people who, Americans producers who are losing their jobs, as well as the American consumers who have to, they're losing their jobs because American consumers don't have as much disposable resources because they have to pay more prices for U.S.-made cars. I mean, there's some of these unintended consequences.
Right.
Are we speaking too generally, saying benefits American producers? I mean, it benefits certain special interest groups, right?
Right, and that's why I said legislation like this, it hits the ears of organized groups, and organized groups are able to influence legislators more easily. So the consumers, the largest unorganized voting group that there is, often get ignored because no one is out in the street saying, what about the consumers?
Well, how that happens, your last point there about, well, at least you said you are, overall you said you'll have to be in favor of this agreement because at least it provides clear expectations.
Right.
How are they clearer than under NAFTA?
They're the same. So it's basically, the idea is their expectations will be met. Hayek talks a lot about having clear expectations for manufacturers. So even if they don't like the expectations, at least they know what they are.
Well, they already know what they are under NAFTA.
Right, but I think the point, having the USMCA will, as an update to NAFTA, will help the intellectual property stuff, and there's a lot of other stuff about technology that we did not have anything close to in the 90s that we have now. But it also, there was no timeline for NAFTA about updating it or amending it. But the USMCA, there's provisions for in 5 years we need to look at updates, in 10 years we need to look at updates. So there are things like that would be beneficial and helpful.
Just have one more question, then I'll stop. Do you really think it's wise policy to protect U.S. automakers by artificially raising price production outside of the United States so that they won't be tempted to send jobs out of the country because it'll be just as expensive there as here? Isn't that basically what it is?
Yeah, I think they try to limit their own protection. Yeah, I would say, probably most American manufacturers are making that anyway. So the idea is to not outsource the production and to keep the production within the United States.
To prevent Americans from buying cars more cheaply made by the comparative
Right.
labor advantage of other.
Right.
President Fleming has a question.
Yes.
Nate, clarification.
Yeah.
Mexico and Canada have signed off on this agreement.
Oh, yes.
Can you speak to that? Therefore, the only holdup is the United States Congress, correct?
Right. I don't know if Canada has or not yet. They may have recently, but Mexico has passed this in through their legal process. And I thought Canada was waiting on to see what the United States did, but yeah, the other two countries are essentially waiting on the United States to pass this into law. And I think it has to go through the House first before it goes to the Senate. And the House, with impeachment inquiries right now going on, it's really unlikely that it'll come up in the fall. So this, if it does get a vote, will probably be in the spring session.
Thank you, Nate.
Thank you.
We'll maybe come back to you if we have an additional question from the audience, but
All
let's give Aaron an opportunity. Let's come back to Nate first. Let's come back to Aaron first, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Thank you for your patience. Senator?
Okay. So it occurs to me that, part of the dynamic in making these value judgments about gene editing for what will be future citizens of this world is a dilemma and a debate between parents and society.
Correct.
It sounds good to say we shouldn't cross that threshold, but
Correct.
if you can tell me that I can prevent my child from having cancer,
Sure.
how are you stepping in the shoes of me as the parent,
Yep.
the person with the most rights in relation to this
Correct.
baby?
Mhm.
So talk to me about the decision-making process and the role of society in it saying that no, you can't do this, or yes, you can, and the role of the parent in those competing value sets.
So that's the crux of the issue, right? That's the meat right there. How do we monitor this overall? And I think one of the biggest things is we all come into these situations with our own personal biases, right? We all come in through our own world views, our lenses that we have, and then we make judgments from that. With gene editing and with that topic of parents having guardianship over their children, right? Because that's essentially what there is. They're their guardians. They're making the decisions for them. It's then difficult to say to a parent, you can't do that to your child, or we're not going to allow you to do that to your child. You see it all the time in restaurants where a child is acting up and somebody says, you need to, and they yell at their child and you say, you can't do that to your child, and they tell you, well, it's my kid, go away. But there are times at which people need to get involved and do have to establish parameters. That's why we have social workers. That's why we have other groups that sometimes have to step in and say, as much as we appreciate the rights of the parent and appreciate the rights of the parent, there's also the rights of the child that we need to be aware of. And with some of these technologies and some of these edits, we don't quite know what's going to happen. And there's going to be experimental pieces to that, and it's probably going to go wrong the first couple of times.
But you're comfortable with that after the child's born, but not before the child's born?
Correct. I would be comfortable after the child is born. From this standpoint and this standpoint alone, we now know what some of the issues are, because some of the pre-screening things that we do can give us an insight, but sometimes it changes and shifts a little bit. I would feel more confident, and I would say my conscience would be more at ease from us allowing it to play out rather than imposing that this happens. Because the moment you open the door up a crack is the moment where we can potentially open up the box too far. And that's something I had to wrestle with in my research. You're absolutely right. How do we still honor that between parents and children, and a parent looking out for their best interests? And I would say, as much as I feel for those parents, and obviously I'm not a parent yet, but in the future I hope to be a parent, I know that would be difficult for me as a parent if I figured out that my child is going to have a genetic disorder.
So let me make it even harder.
Okay.
Right now, society will step in through the legal process for parents who fail to treat children based upon religious beliefs.
Correct.
A guardian will be put in place. For example, a child needs a surgery or has a disease.
The Christian Scientist argument, right?
Christian Scientist, it happens a lot with. It happens with other faith-based groups. And the court will say, no, parents, you have to allow your child to have this treatment.
Correct.
Wouldn't the same thing apply to this? If there's a gene editing technology that allows for juvenile diabetes to be removed before
Sure.
the child is born, and the parents say, no, we're not going to do that because we're against it morally,
Yep.
will courts be coming in and telling parents they have to allow for it?
And that is a good question, and I appreciate that, because that, again, hits at the issue really deeply. To be quite honest, I wrestled with it, and I haven't really found a concrete argument on for or against the courts coming in and making that decision. I'll be honest about that, because you're absolutely right. If a court is going to come in based upon the beliefs that we've established and say you have to edit your child, and I as a parent don't believe that that's necessarily the best course of action or the best course of treatment, I'm stuck at that point. And I think it really plays a large part in society, indicating that there is a line to be drawn, but we haven't found where that line is yet. Is the line between somatic cell and germline editing? I think that would be the safest line to draw from both of those, still honoring the child and still honoring the parents. But you're absolutely right. With those edits that are within that vein of therapeutic, in that vein of medicinally valuable, again, I struggle to figure out where the line is drawn, because then we're then talking about conditions of not just diabetes anymore. We're then talking about conditions of, well, as a parent, should I be allowed to make my child deaf because I'm deaf as well? That's actually something that's happened, where parents who are deaf want to make their children like them. And then it's tough. And I would say that I don't have a concrete answer. I'm sorry.
Dr. Doherty, any questions? Chris?
Yes. Well, thank you. Aaron did a wonderful job to
Thank you.
take a very complex subject and try to boil it down so we could understand. I know one of the kind of aha moments we had when we were talking with the senator last spring was just the idea of technology in general, and how far as a society do we want to go with technology, and
Correct.
Are we getting to the point where we're going to let technology rule us? And then you always have the early adopters, right?
Correct.
So as I was sitting here thinking about it, like the people that have to have the latest, greatest, right? And you talk a lot also, and we talked a lot about the parent-child relationship and how that could be altered. So you have these people jumping in the latest, greatest, how is that going to affect the decisions that parents might make as well?
Correct. So talking with the technology piece, I wasn't able to quite get to it, but technology, we're pressured to think technology and quality of life. So, how our life operates, what type of, life that we have is always a positive correlation. That the more technology you have, the better our quality of life is going to be. And I would say that we're pressured to think that, but that may not necessarily be the case. That it may be a return value and investment that sometimes doesn't always meet the need. Namely this, at some point we reach a point where technology does not enhance our quality of life, it starts to degrade it a little bit. It starts to take away some of the core things like hope, things like beauty, things like trust. It starts to degrade those things and take those away because we're so dependent on technology. I think all of us could agree that this device in our pocket is wonderful, but is also very divisive and separates us as a society quite literally. I sit on the plane and I'm not able to talk to people across the way because they're too engulfed in their phones or technology. Is technology always a positive correlation? I would say not. But to your point with the parent-child, the latest and greatest type of piece, yes, there are going to be early adopters if this is allowed to just run freely. And people are going to want to use this technology, which, like I mentioned before, is going to put pressure on the average person to make a really hard ethical decision about editing their child or not editing their child. And when we get to that point, that's why we need to have these discussions. And I would say that it will be very dangerous and actually exacerbate and degrade the relationship between a parent and a child to one that is more representative of a consumer and a product almost.
Dr. Reeder.
Yeah, I just have one question.
Yeah.
How much confidence do you have? You spoke frequently about having to rein in or regulate or somehow
Yep.
bound to this research.
Correct.
Do you have confidence? I mean, I will be honest, that all the bioethical committees in the world, it seems to me, and all the laws we pass are not actually going to stop this research. People will be doing it anyway, and one day you'll wake up and there'll be anyway, am I wrong about that? I hope I am, but I just don't see how think this is going to be, I think there's an existential drive.
Correct, and
about the
that's-
Trump law.
You're absolutely hitting on the point. If we potentially ban this research, it's all going to go underground, right? Which is why I think we're at a healthy place in discussing it and keeping the conversation open, because I'm very willing to say I might be wrong about the health piece, that maybe there are some medicinal values for germline editing that we can use. I'm very willing to admit that, but I feel very confident right now that the moment we continue to go that direction is the moment we continue to go down that path of now shaping our society based upon its genetics, rather than allowing society to be free and having those choices made for the future. So you're absolutely right. I don't think this research is going to stop, but we can put safeguards in place, and as a society as a whole, we can continue to move forward. The same thing happened with human cloning. There were plenty of people trying to clone the next human, whatever that was. There were cults known as the Raelian cult trying to clone human beings. There were a couple of scientists here and there trying to make it happen. They weren't able to fully realize it, and that's the problem with genetic editing. We have fully realized our potential of how we can edit human beings, and that is the difficult piece of trying to rein it in.
Okay, I'm going to bring the microphone. For those of you who are old enough to remember Phil Donahue, we're going to bring the microphone out in the audience and ask a short question. We'll try to get in as many as we can.
When we talk about gene editing, I think that we always have to remember that we thought that gene editing grains and things like that would have a positive consequence. Mm-hmm. Consequently, we have now found that modified foods aren't necessarily healthy. So we maybe should learn from that.
It's possible.
Unexpected consequences is something that I think that out of the body, out of the womb, I'm sorry, you have a better chance of a result that you can control. Inside the womb, I think the body's changes could cause changes to your modification that would be, you would get unintended consequences.
Correct. There's actually some different treatments that we already do known as pre-implantation diagnosis, where we actually are able to take the embryo out and take a peek at it and see what their genetics are. And in vitro fertilization, all of these different techniques where we could potentially introduce the edits before they're ever implanted into the human being, into the woman, and make that happen. So this is very real and would actually take that whole process of making a child and basically make it more of a product and make it more of manufacture, I would say, to a large degree. So you're absolutely right.
My name is Velma Lee. I'm a faculty at the Rinker School of Business. I continue to have a question for Aaron.
Okay.
I cannot agree with you more on this very controversial topic, and thank you for a very inspiring presentation.
Thank you very much.
I have been studying the intersection of technology, ethics, and agriculture.
Gotcha.
And at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about how gene editing could be beneficial to the efficiency, output of agriculture, pest resistance, and all that. And it happened that just 24 hours ago, I picked up a magazine called Eating Well, because down here it says, besides gene-edited tomatoes, what else will be on your plates tomorrow? Mm-hmm. So I want to have your personal opinion.
Sure.
When it comes to gene editing and going into the food, how much do you infer the conclusion you have from the human side that you would extend to the food? Or do you actually believe there's more benefit for gene editing into food than into the human
Correct.
body?
Genetically modified food, I think, has been done to death in today's society. Everybody's got an opinion on, GMOs. Are they good? Are they bad? And I think it's a mixed bag. I think we have good genetically modified food, and to be quite honest, we've genetically modified organisms for thousands of years. Basically, we've taken the best crops that we get, we mix them together, that's a genetically modified organism, because we've taken the best of the best and bred it together. Where genetic modified organisms go awry, I would say, is when we start taking genes from other organisms and putting them in a different plant. So taking a gene that's in a human, putting it into a tomato. Taking a gene from, a cow and putting that hormone within a fish. Like, those are where I think it oversteps. But if we're using it inside of the genetics that that plant or animal has, I think that's okay to a degree. You can look up online of this gene known as myostatin. You can actually double this gene within cows, and they basically look like bodybuilders. The meat is leaner. The meat is healthier to a degree because there's not as much fat. It's all muscle and tendon. You're absolutely right. I think there are some pieces with that, but I think within the terms of just what I know of genetics, as long as it's within that organism and we're using only genes that are within that organism, I won't consider that 100% genetically modified because we've done that before.
So we'll have our impossible burgers being eaten by impossible people.
Correct.
Thank you, Senator. Good evening. Thank you very much for just a really, truly compelling presentation, absolutely. Towards the end of it, you said your question was, with regard to all of this, where is that limit, where is that line we're willing to draw? And I hope I've got that quote accurate.
Correct.
The line, it would seem to me, and this is what I would like you to address, is the marketplace, number one.
Sure.
Number two, it is the very changing mores of society.
Mm-hmm.
If you have those two things working concurrently, acting as, I would submit, intense pressure,
Correct.
I don't see how crossing that line does not occur.
Yep.
For example, I don't see the mad dash, I don't see the great clamor, I don't see the protests all of the 1960s, for example, to stop robotics, artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if one goes on YouTube, I see a very disturbing interest in it.
Correct.
So what are your thoughts on that?
And that plays into the transhumanist bioconservative argument that I had and talked about. Transhumanists are those people pushing for the best technology and best advancement. And as long as they, I shall say, control the narrative to a degree, that technology always offers us benefits, you're absolutely right. We're going to continue that way. But as bioconservatives, and I think as Christians, we can all look at it from this standpoint of there is a line, there is a limit. There is we need to take a look at it and wonder why and whether our world is going to be better off with it or without it. And as I said before, germline editing, I believe, steps over that boundary. Somatic cell editing is still within that confines where those edits aren't passed on to future generations, and we're able to control it better because we have an idea of what's going on. So to address your point, you're absolutely right, but I think that's where bioconservatives and Christians need to be actively involved in this conversation and be a part of it. Right now, 83% of Americans, again, believe that editing for just the sake of enhancement is wrong. And I think that's a good number to have, and we need to keep it at that point.
You briefly spoke upon cancer patients. Would this be able to affect small parts of cancer or different forms of cancer? And at what stages would it be effective?
So it would be effective at all stages. That's what to be quite honest, we haven't seen, the research is still very far out that we haven't seen what types of cancer it can cure. But all cancer cells, what they do is they fly under the radar of the immune system and basically trick the body into thinking that they're good cells. So if we're able to create a receptor for our white blood cells to latch on, we basically give our body a built-in vaccine, a built-in immune system to fight off cancer and keep it in remission. That's why this is so important. That's why this is so critical, because it's the next big step, I would say, in cancer research.
Great job, Aaron. If we assume that the marketplace pushes this forward, crosses all the lines that you've previously mentioned, do you think it would have an effect, if any, on the abortion rate in our society?
That's a tough one. And thinking about it this way, if germline editing is within the purview and within society as a whole, and we choose germline editing and say that we're going to allow it, I think the abortion rate drops. I think parents shift to, now I'm going to genetically edit my child so they don't have any issues, right? I would say it drops in that sense. But we have to think about what we're sacrificing then with that piece of it. And I think for all the lists and reasons that I've laid out, that human life is valuable even if there are issues, even if there are troubles. And again, I know I say this not as a parent and somebody who hasn't had that happen, but I have a sister who has diabetes. I know every single day I would hope and pray that might go away, but I know it won't. And I realize that, and I have to walk with that every single day, knowing that she has to go through that struggle. I have no idea what that's like, but I know that she's still a functional human being. She's a wonderful young lady of God. I appreciate her every single day. And I know that plenty of other parents who have children who are genetically disordered would say the same. People who do have Down syndrome and autism, all of those pieces. You hear of the horror stories, but there are also good stories there. So I would say the abortion rate would drop if germline editing was introduced.
Aaron, thank you so much. This question is actually for Nate. At the beginning, you mentioned a correlation between Nafta and increased illegal immigration in the United States. Does the USMNC, I think I'm using the right acronym, is there any research done into the effect that it might have on immigration in the United States?
No. I mean, there's no research been done, as far as I am aware, about the impact it could have on curbing illegal immigration, but I would say it's unlikely that it would. The reason NAFTA didn't stimulate the Mexican economy as expected was because the tariffs and stuff that were in place that were actually protecting the Mexican jobs were gone, and so cheaper goods were coming in that they were protected from previously. And so without an existing job market and strong economy, they had to decide what was best for them, and they decided for them it was get into America where there's greater opportunity. So yeah, I don't think it will change much of the legal immigration rate if it is passed, though.
We'll do a couple more.
This one's for Aaron. Good job.
Thank you.
This is kind of on the topic of the world today. So in a world that kind of struggles with the issues of identity, kids specifically, because I think we've kind of focused more on a top-down aspect opposed to looking from down up. Do you think that the genetically modified kids, or even the kids who weren't modified, will be ready for such a societal shift?
You have hit on the point that I wanted to talk about, but just didn't have the time. What does that generation look like of kids who have been genetically altered? And Bill McKibben, in his book Enough, if you haven't read it, I highly suggest you do, looks at it this way. He says, those kids are going to have such a struggle that we are not able to even remotely understand, because they're going to ask themselves, am I good at this because I've worked hard at it, that I've invested all of this time, or am I good at this because I've been genetically altered to do it? And that's a tough identity piece to have, right? We invest and we have identity in the things that we do, right? We invest because we're a good basketball player, so we play basketball a lot. We invest in school because we're good at school or we're good at science. But what if I'm genetically altered to be good at that already? Does that lessen the high and the achievement that I see with such an achievement, right? If I get A's and B's on my report card and I was genetically altered to do that, does that really mean anything? And the other question Bill McKibben asks is, are those kids even going to think that way in the first place? And that might be the biggest taking of, I would say, the free will of a person to a degree, if they don't quite understand that they've been edited and altered to do such a thing.
Hi, this question is for Aaron. The last point you make is about how we should evaluate gene editing from a theological perspective in terms of our Christian worldview.
Yep.
Frequently across the scope of the Christian faith, we see a really close intersection of the physical and the spiritual, such as prayer and fasting.
Yep.
Now, in your opinion, germline editing, we edit future generations ahead of whatever it is that they're going to do. A means of sanctification such as suffering, which is a theology clearly expressed in Scripture, we've essentially then eliminated that. Would that then, in your opinion, change the way that theology is seen from this new gene editing type of way of thinking about the theology of suffering?
Sam, this is why we stayed up for multiple nights, and this is why you're my best friend. So here's my thing with that. If we eliminate, basically what we would be eliminating with gene editing is we would be eliminating physical suffering, right? All of the physical characteristics and traits and vices that we have to work with. Does that then eliminate the mental, emotional, and spiritual suffering? I say no. Even if we have that physical piece, those are gonna be there. But I think you're absolutely right in realizing that this issue is much bigger than just me talking about it on a PowerPoint slide, that this is going to affect way more and have more, as the man in front of you had, unintended consequences that we may not be ready for and we may not understand. And that might, to your point, that might be something that we have to consider in terms of the greater theological, spiritual battle that we face with. Does that minimize or lessen our walk with God if we don't have those physical struggles? Are we able to trust on God, depend on God more if those things aren't there? It's a good question.
Three more. This gentleman in the back, and then Dr. Wood. Thank you both. This is for Aaron. I appreciate your discussion specifically of the idea of health and the two different definitions looking at an equilibrium. I had a question. I know you discussed the idea that there's not better genes, that an increase in intelligence could correlate with other harms potentially to someone.
Yep.
Is there a distinction between something that's a dramatic lack of what is supposed to be a natural human faculty, so something like blindness, when the majority of people can see on one level or another, and a trait that's maybe more neutral, like intelligence, that could come with a cost benefit? Is there a distinction, especially considering the idea of somatic editing, to solve potentially some of those infirmities?
So that's a good question. I guess I'll follow that up with kind of a similar question. Are people who are blind or deaf or have Down syndrome or have autism have not as full of a life as people who don't have those conditions? And I would say no. I'd say they can have just as full of a life, just as beneficial of a life over people that have sight. Sight is a great benefit. Sight dictates a lot of what we do as human beings. But sight can sometimes be blinding to what is actually there sometimes. We're so focused on the external, we don't focus on the internal. And I think when we take away that sight, other things start to pop up. I think that would be a potential way of looking at it. And looking at it in terms of the genome, absolutely, there are benefits of actually giving somebody the ability to produce insulin or giving them the ability to have full red blood cells so they don't sickle and basically destroy our arteries. Those would be indications of benefits. But I can tell you this, though, those who, over in Africa, those who have sickle cell anemia actually have a resistance against malaria. And so there's this correlation between people of color and sickle cell anemia because of the fact that over in Africa, it provides them an advantage against malaria. Those who have a heterozygotic advantage where they have one gene that produces good blood cells and one gene that doesn't, those people don't die from malaria. The ones that do are ones that have both genes that are good for red blood cells, and those are the ones that die without medical intervention. Those that have that heterozygotic advantage actually are able to live and keep living. And that's what I mean by there's no trade-offs. We don't understand all of genetics. Genetics is complicated, and there are a lot of other factors. And what have we seen with the research is there's no competitive advantage of some genes over others.
Hi, this question is for Nate. You mentioned the current division in politics and the impeachment proceedings against Trump right now. And I was wondering, what does the future of this trade agreement look like if Trump was impeached or if we were elected a new president next year?
Good question. I think it still has to come for a vote, and if it's a no, then it will not be passed and will continue under Nafta as it is in effect. If Trump is impeached and removed from office, then Pence will take over and there will still be time for a vote. So I don't know. It's hard to tell. But even if it is passed, then it probably will be passed with significant changes. Because, yeah, again, like I said, nobody wants to give the president right now, from the opposite side of the aisle, a win. So if they can change it significantly to where it's not a win for the president, then they probably will do that.
This is for Nate. This is a trade question. My name is Robert Lloyd. Let's take a look at it from Mexico's perspective. During NAFTA and prior to NAFTA and post-NAFTA, Canada and the U.S. were essentially an informal economic federation. Mexico was the outlier. NAFTA helped bring Mexico in closer alignment with North America. Was NAFTA successful at that goal, and would the revision to NAFTA further that process or hinder it?
Good question. Mexico was a developing country before NAFTA. It's still a developing country, but it's progressed much further than it was. Now, if that is, it's hard, like I said earlier, to say that if that's a direct correlation to NAFTA, or if that was just the progress they were making already. But I would say anytime a country opens itself to more trade means that there's a lot more room for economic advancement in that country. And so I think the passing of the USMCA would just continue the liberalizing of the trade in Mexico, which overall will help the advancement of the economy.
Would you join me in saluting these two young scholars? Would you also join me in thanking Dr. Doherty and Dr. Rader? Tonight you've seen the best of Palm Beach Atlantic. You've seen enlightened minds who have talked about ways to enrich souls and at the same time extend hands. The best of Palm Beach Atlantic University has been on display through the LeMieux Center for Public Policy. And Senator, we're thankful that your dream has come true at PBA. And we invite you back again next October as we launch the 2020 Family Weekend celebration with a presentation by the Friedheim Fellows of the LeMieux Center. Who they will be chosen in the next couple of weeks, and you'll be able to learn their topics and their backgrounds with that announcement. But tonight, we have seen excellence in front of us. We understand that the LeMieux Center for Public Policy was focused, continues to be focused, on providing serious thought to serious thinkers. And tonight, we've seen that on display. We hope that you will join us on December the 2nd as Dr. Albert Brooks joins us here on the beautiful campus of Palm Beach Atlantic University. But for tonight, we say thank you for joining us and wish you a good evening.